My wife spent months texting her male friends while sitting next to me. Her friends called it self-care. Our daughter asked why mom laughed harder at her phone than at dad. She replied, because dad's not that funny. I just nodded. 3 weeks later, I took a job in Texas and vanished. She only looked up when her card declined. Look, I never thought I'd be the guy sitting at a marriage counselor's office, Googling, can a smartphone be cited as a co-respondent in a divorce? But here we are, and let me tell you, the universe has a twisted sense of humor. My name's Derek Lawson. I'm 34 years old. I manage logistics for a mid-sized distribution company that ships everything from dog food to those weird foam rollers people use to torture themselves after yoga. And up until about 6 months ago, I thought I had a pretty solid life. I'm talking about the American Dream Starter Pack. Decent job with benefits, a 2-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood where you only hear gunshots on New Year's Eve, a daughter who still thinks I'm cool, and a wife who I genuinely believed loved me more than her iPhone. Spoiler alert, I was wrong about that last part, and the realization hit me harder than that time I rear-ended a FedEx truck because I was checking my fantasy football lineup. My wife Tara, beautiful, smart, formerly attentive Tara, somehow morphed from the woman who used to laugh at my terrible dad jokes into someone who reserves her best reactions for a glowing rectangle that she clutches like it contains the nuclear codes. I'm not exaggerating when I say our marriage didn't crumble because of the usual suspects like infidelity and financial problems or discovering she had a secret passion for collecting porcelain clowns. No, our relationship got murdered by something far more insidious and socially acceptable: group chats. Multiple group chats. An entire ecosystem of group chats that apparently required her undivided attention 23 hours a day, with the remaining hour reserved for charging her phone and occasionally acknowledging my existence. Tara called this phenomenon staying connected with her support network, which is therapists speak for I'm going to ignore my husband while I send laughing emojis to people you've never met. I called it being married to Wi-Fi, which is bitter husband speak for I'm pretty sure I've been replaced by a notification sound. Our evenings developed a predictable rhythm that would make a metronome jealous. I'd come home from work, ask about her day, get a distracted fine in response, cook dinner while she giggled at her screen from the couch, serve the food, eat in silence while she continued her digital romance with whatever group was currently demanding her attention, clean up, help Maya with homework, and go to bed next to a woman who was probably still texting under the covers like a teenager hiding from her parents. The kicker? I was the parent and I couldn't even confiscate the damn phone. The whole setup looked like a sitcom, except nobody was laughing except Tara, and she was laughing at her screen like it was performing a sold-out comedy special featuring Dave Chappelle, Kevin Hart, and a young Richard Pryor all at once. Meanwhile, I'm sitting across from her doing my best impression of furniture, contributing about as much to her evening entertainment as the throw pillows she kept rearranging. I'd make a joke, get a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes, and watch her immediately return to whatever conversation was clearly more engaging than anything her husband of 8 years could possibly offer. I started timing it once. I got exactly 4 seconds of eye contact before her gaze drifted back to the screen. 4 seconds, and I've gotten more attention from the guy who checks receipts at Costco. But the moment that really shattered my illusion that everything was fine, the moment that cracked my soul like a fortune cookie that contained the message, your marriage is a joke and you're the punchline, came from our 7-year-old daughter, Maya. Sweet, observant, brutally honest Maya, who inherited her mother's intelligence and apparently my talent for asking questions that nobody wants to answer. We were having another one of our silent dinners. I'd made spaghetti carbonara because I'm not a quitter and still believed good food might spark human interaction. When Maya looked up from her own plate, glanced at her mother, who was, you guessed it, staring at her phone with a grin that suggested someone had just sent her the funniest meme in the history of the internet, and asked the question that would haunt me for months. Mom, why do you laugh harder at your phone than at Dad? The table went silent, except for the sound of Tara's thumbs still typing. I stopped mid-chew, a piece of pasta probably dangling from my fork like my dignity dangling from the last thread of this marriage. I watched my wife process the question, watched her actually consider whether she should lie to our daughter or just commit to the truth, and then I watched her make her choice. Without even looking up, without missing a single beat in whatever conversation was clearly more important than this teachable parenting moment, Tara replied, because Dad's not that funny. I smiled. I actually smiled. Because what else are you supposed to do when your wife publicly roasts you in front of your child during dinner on a Tuesday? I couldn't very well flip the table and scream, "I'm hilarious, damn it!" I got Employee of the Month for my presentation on warehouse efficiency, and I made 3 people laugh during that PowerPoint. So I smiled, nodded, took another bite of my carbonara that suddenly tasted like cardboard and broken dreams, and pretended that my internal organs weren't rearranging themselves in real time. Inside my chest, I felt the gears grinding, metal on metal, the sound of machinery breaking down after too many miles without maintenance, and my heart, my pride, my sense of self-worth, all of it started making this horrible screeching noise that only I could hear. The worst part wasn't even the insult itself. I mean, yeah, being told you're not funny by the person who promised to love you, for better or worse, stings worse than that time I touched a hot pan and didn't realize it for a solid 3 seconds. But the real gut punch was watching Maya's reaction. She just nodded like this made perfect sense. Like she'd suspected all along that Dad was basically the human equivalent of elevator music. Present, technically functional, but ultimately forgettable and easily ignored. My own daughter, my mini-me, the kid I'd taught to ride a bike and make pancakes and do that weird whistle where you put your fingers in your mouth, was starting to see me the way her mother did. As background noise, the supporting character in someone else's story. The guy who pays the bills and fixes the Wi-Fi but doesn't warrant the same attention as a group chat notification. I realized right then, with pasta cooling on my plate and my wife's face illuminated by the blue glow of her screen like some kind of modern religious icon worshiping at the altar of social media, that I wasn't just losing my marriage. I was training my daughter to think this was normal. I was teaching her that it's perfectly acceptable for men to be ignored, for husbands to be less important than strangers on the internet, for fathers to be the punchline instead of the person you actually want to spend time with. Maya was learning in real time that love looks like divided attention. That marriage means someone gets the leftovers of your energy after you've given the best parts to people who don't even know your middle name. I finished my dinner in silence, cleared the plates while Tara continued texting, helped Maya brush her teeth, and read her a story about a dragon who felt invisible. Way too on the nose, but she picked it. And went to bed next to a woman who was still glued to her phone, probably telling her online friends about her exhausting day, while the man lying next to her wondered when exactly he'd become a ghost in his own life. That night, staring at the ceiling while Tara's phone cast shadows across our bedroom, I understood something fundamental. My family thought I was the background track to someone else's comedy special, and if I didn't do something about it, I'd spend the rest of my life being the guy nobody remembered to unmute. Now, before you start thinking I'm some jealous, insecure husband who loses his mind every time his wife has friends, let me clarify something important. I'm not that guy. I've never been that guy. When Tara and I first got married, she had plenty of friends. Jessica from her book club, Monica from yoga, that weird girl named Patricia who collected vintage lunchboxes and smelled like patchouli. And I actively encouraged those friendships because I'm not a controlling psychopath who thinks marriage means locking your spouse in a tower like some discount Rapunzel situation. I wanted her to have a life outside our marriage, to maintain her identity, to have people she could complain to when I inevitably did something stupid like forget to buy milk or accidentally wash her favorite sweater with my work jeans and turn everything a lovely shade of industrial gray. That's healthy, that's normal. That's what people in functioning relationships do. But here's where the plot twisted harder than a pretzel at a German festival. Tara's friend group underwent what I can only describe as a hostile takeover by testosterone. Her female friends, the ones who'd been around since before I entered the picture, slowly disappeared like characters getting written off a TV show nobody's watching anymore. Jessica moved to Portland and apparently fell off the face of the earth. Monica got pregnant with twins and entered what Tara called the boring mom phase, which was rich coming from someone who was also a mom but apparently had transcended that mundane label by texting dudes at midnight. Patricia just stopped getting invited to things after she made the mistake of asking Tara why she was always on her phone during their coffee dates. And into this vacuum, this friendship void, came the trio of men who would eventually make me feel like I was competing in a reality show called Who Wants to Marry My Wife? Let me introduce you to the cast of characters, the supporting actors in the slow-motion disaster film that was my marriage. Lucas, Trent, and Eli. Their names sounded like a lineup of guys I'd actively avoid at a gym. The kind of dudes who grunt loudly during bench presses and take mirror selfies between sets while pretending they're just checking their form. Lucas was apparently recovering from a devastating breakup with a woman named Amber or Ashley or some other A name that Tara mentioned so many times I started wondering if she was memorizing it for a test. According to the scripture of Tara's nightly phone sessions, Lucas was sensitive, emotionally available, and really struggling with the transition back to single life, which apparently required my wife's round-the-clock emotional support, like he was a premature baby in a NICU, instead of a grown man who could presumably call his own mother or, I don't know, an actual therapist. Then there was Trent, the aspiring entrepreneur who needed advice on his business. What business, you ask? Excellent question. I asked the same thing once, and Tara gave me this vague answer about digital consulting and brand management, which is what people say when they're either running a Ponzi scheme or have absolutely no idea what they're doing, but want to sound important. Trent was always in crisis mode, always needing guidance on whether to pivot his strategy or double down on his vision or some other business speak nonsense that required lengthy text conversations with my wife, who, and I cannot stress this enough, works as a dental hygienist and has exactly zero experience in business consulting, digital or otherwise. But apparently, her insights were invaluable, crucial even to Trent's success, and he needed to hear them immediately. Even if it was 9:30 on a Wednesday night and her husband was trying to discuss our daughter's parent-teacher conference. And finally, we had Eli, the crown jewel of this emotional support circus, the guy whose cat died. Not just died, we're talking about a death that apparently required a grief counseling hotline. Except the hotline was my wife's phone number, and the counseling sessions ran longer than a Peter Jackson director's cut. This cat, whose name I refuse to remember because I've already given this situation too much mental real estate, became the center of more conversations than our actual marriage. Eli would send updates about his grieving process, photos of the empty cat bed, philosophical musings about pet loss and the nature of companionship, and Tara would respond with the kind of empathy and emotional availability that I hadn't seen directed at me since approximately 2000 and never. I once came home to find her literally crying over a voice message Eli had sent about missing his cat's purring. And when I asked if she was okay, she waved me off and said, "You wouldn't understand. It's really deep." Meanwhile, back in reality, I'd lost my wife to a group chat that operated with the intensity of a military operation and the drama of a soap opera. Her phone became a constant source of dopamine hits, vibrating and dinging and lighting up with the frequency of a slot machine that was rigged to always pay out. Every notification sparked this Pavlovian response in Tara. Her eyes would light up, her fingers would fly across the screen, and she'd emit these little laughs and gasps like she was watching the most entertaining content ever produced by human civilization. I could walk into a room juggling chainsaws while on fire and playing the accordion, and I'd still get less of a reaction than whatever Lucas just said about his feelings, or Trent texted about his business breakthrough, or Eli shared about his therapeutic journey through feline bereavement, the real kicker. The detail that really drove home how completely I'd been replaced in my own marriage was Tara's new vocabulary around all this. Every time I tried to initiate a conversation, suggest we have a phone-free evening, or gently point out that maybe spending 3 hours texting other men while your husband folded laundry wasn't exactly relationship goals, she'd hit me with the magic word, self-care. "Babe, it's just self-care," she'd say, like she was explaining basic hygiene to a toddler. "I need this for my mental health. These connections are important to me. You should be happy I have such a strong support system." And what could I say to that? In today's world, if you criticize someone's self-care routine, you might as well admit you hate wellness, despise mental health, and probably kick puppies in your spare time. Self-care had become this unassailable fortress that justified any behavior, any amount of time spent ignoring your actual family in favor of digital relationships with people who didn't have to deal with your dirty laundry or your morning breath or the reality of who you were when the phone was finally dead. But the moment that really crystallized how far down the rabbit hole we'd gone, the moment that made me realize I wasn't just losing my marriage, but potentially screwing up my kids' understanding of healthy relationships, came during another riveting dinner where Tara was glued to her phone and I was performing my usual role as the invisible man. Maya, bless her observant little heart, suddenly put down her fork, picked up her napkin, held it to her ear like a phone, and started giggling into it like she was having the most hilarious conversation with an imaginary friend. "Oh my gosh, that's so funny," she said to the napkin in a pitch-perfect imitation of her mother. "Tell me more about your cat. I'm such a good listener." I looked at Tara to see if she'd caught this devastating piece of mimicry, this mirror being held up to her behavior by our 7-year-old daughter. She hadn't. She was too busy actually texting, probably to the real Eli about the real dead cat, completely oblivious to the fact that our child was learning to cosplay as an emotionally unavailable parent. Maya continued her performance, laughing at her napkin, typing on an invisible phone, saying uh-huh and wow, and that's so deep to absolutely nothing, and I felt something inside me crack wider. This wasn't just about me anymore, about my bruised ego or my lonely evenings or my growing resentment toward 3 men I'd never even met. This was about Maya learning that this was normal, that mothers ignore their families for their phones, that a real connection matters less than digital validation, that the people physically present in your life are somehow less important than the ones who can be muted with a single button. That night, after Maya was asleep and Tara was still texting, because of course she was, I sat in our living room and had a moment of absolute clarity. I wasn't just competing with Lucas, Trent, and Eli for my wife's attention. I was losing to them. And worse, I was teaching my daughter that losing was normal. The male friends club had won, and I hadn't even realized we were in a competition until the trophy had already been handed out, and I was standing there like an idiot, holding my participation ribbon, and wondering when exactly staying connected had become more important than actually being present for the people who loved you most. There's this thing that happens in relationships where you can pinpoint the exact moment everything shifted, the precise instant when you went from being someone's priority to being someone's inconvenience. For some people, it's dramatic, walking in on your spouse with the yoga instructor or finding a suspicious credit card bill for a hotel you've never been to. For me, it was a Friday night movie date that I'd planned with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for people who think they can still save something that's already dead. I'm talking about full commitment here. I left work early, stopped at that fancy Italian market where a jar of olives cost more than my monthly Netflix subscription, bought fresh pasta and pancetta for carbonara, because Tara once mentioned it was her favorite dish back when she still mentioned things to me, grabbed a bottle of wine that the store clerk assured me was sophisticated but approachable, which I later realized was also how I'd describe a golden retriever, and even cleaned the apartment to the point where you could actually see the coffee table instead of just assuming it existed under the pile of Amazon boxes and Maya's art projects. I had this whole vision in my head, this Norman Rockwell painting of domestic bliss where we'd cook together. Maybe she'd laugh at one of my jokes. We'd sit down for dinner like actual adults who chose to marry each other, and then we'd watch The Notebook, because even though I think that movie is emotional terrorism designed to make men feel inadequate about their romantic gestures, I knew Tara loved it, and I was willing to endure 2 hours of Ryan Gosling being impossibly perfect if it meant reconnecting with my wife. I even lit candles, which in retrospect feels pathetic, like I was trying to romance someone into remembering they were married to me. The scene was set, the food was cooking, the wine was breathing, or whatever wine does when you open it early, and I genuinely believed that maybe, just maybe, we could have one evening where her phone stayed face down and her attention stayed on us. Tara came home at 6:30, walked past me without really seeing me, said something about work being crazy, and immediately collapsed on the couch with her phone like a marathoner crossing the finish line. I called out from the kitchen that dinner would be ready in 20 minutes, got a distracted "sounds good" in response, and watched through the doorway as she immediately descended into her digital world, her face illuminating with that glow that used to be reserved for when she looked at me but was now exclusively for whatever Lucas or Trent or Eli was saying. I told myself it was fine, that she just needed to decompress, that once we sat down for dinner, everything would click back into place like a dislocated shoulder getting popped back into its socket. Painful, but ultimately necessary and healing. Dinner was ready at 7. I plated it like I was on one of those cooking shows where presentation matters, poured the wine into the glasses we'd gotten as wedding gifts and barely ever used, and called Tara to the table with the kind of forced cheerfulness that probably made me sound like a children's TV host having a nervous breakdown. She came, she sat, she even said the food looked amazing, And for approximately 45 seconds, I thought we might actually pull this off. Then her phone buzzed, and buzzed again, and then started going off like someone was playing a xylophone with the notification sounds, and I watched my wife's attention splinter in real time. Watched her eyes drift from me to the screen, watched her pick up the phone just to check what was happening, and then watched her face transform into something I hadn't seen directed at me in months. Genuine joy. Lucas is so hilarious, she said, not to me exactly, but to the space between us, her fingers already flying across the keyboard with the speed and precision of a court stenographer on cocaine. I took a bite of carbonara that I'd spent 45 minutes perfecting and tasted absolutely nothing because my taste buds had apparently gone on strike in solidarity with my dying marriage. What did he say? I asked, trying to sound interested rather than homicidal, hoping that maybe if I engaged with her digital life, she'd remember I existed in her physical one. She didn't even look up. You wouldn't get it. It's an inside joke. An inside joke with Lucas, her phone husband, the man who was apparently funnier, more interesting, and more deserving of her laughter than the actual human being sitting across from her, who just cooked her favorite meal and was currently contemplating whether it was possible to drown in a wine glass if you tried hard enough. The movie started at 8. I'd queued up the Notebook on our TV, refilled our wine glasses, and positioned myself on the couch in what I hoped was an inviting but not desperate posture, which is harder than it sounds when you're essentially begging your wife to acknowledge your existence. Tara settled in next to me, phone in hand naturally, and I made it through the opening credits before her phone started vibrating like it was having a seizure. Not just once or twice, but continuously. A relentless assault of notifications that made me wonder if Lucas, Trent, and Eli had formed a group chat specifically designed to ruin my evening. Each buzz was accompanied by Tara's fingers moving, her attention fracturing, her presence in the room becoming more theoretical than actual. She giggled through the scene where Noah and Allie meet, typed frantically through their first kiss, and let out this snort laugh during the rain scene. You know the one, where Ryan Gosling asks what Rachel McAdams wants, and she screams, "It's not that simple." Except Tara wasn't laughing at the movie. She was laughing at her phone, at whatever comedy gold Lucas had just dropped. That was apparently more romantic and engaging than what's widely considered one of the most romantic scenes in modern cinema. I tried to start a conversation during a quiet moment in the film. Something innocuous about work or maybe weekend plans with Maya, and Tara held up one finger, literally held up one finger like I was a waiter interrupting an important business meeting, and said, without looking at me, "You're interrupting my mental break." I just sat there, frozen, processing what I just heard. I was interrupting her mental break. Me, her husband, person she'd vowed to love and cherish and presumably actually interact with, was interrupting the sacred time she needed to text other men while pretending to watch a movie she'd requested. I nodded because what else was I supposed to do, and returned my attention to the screen where Ryan Gosling was building a house with his bare hands to win back the love of his life. And I couldn't help but think that maybe if I learned carpentry and built Tara a house, she'd still pick her phone over me because at least her phone never asked her to put it down or pay attention to something other than the endless scroll of content and conversation that apparently mattered more than anything I could offer. The credits rolled at 10:15. The wine was gone. The candles had burned down to stubs. My romantic gesture had been thoroughly ignored in favor of what I can only assume was the most riveting group chat in human history. Tara looked up from her phone, actually looked up, made eye contact for the first time in over 2 hours, and said, "Oh, it's over already?" Like she was surprised that a 2-hour movie had lasted 2 hours. Like time had somehow accelerated while she was in her digital bubble. Like the evening she'd completely missed while sitting 18 inches away from me was somehow confusing in its passage. "Yeah," I said, my voice flat, dead, the vocal equivalent of a dial tone. "It's over already." She stood up, stretched, said something about being tired, and headed to the bedroom while still texting, probably telling Lucas or Trent or the ghost of Eli's cat about her exhausting day. I sat on the couch for another 20 minutes, staring at the Netflix menu, listening to the sound of her getting ready for bed in the next room while her phone continued its constant chirping. That's when it hit me with the force of a freight train carrying nothing but crushing realizations. The movie was over, but she hadn't noticed, because she was never really watching it. Our dinner was finished, but she hadn't tasted it because she was never really present for it. And our marriage, our actual, legal, supposedly sacred marriage, was done, completely finished, deceased, and awaiting burial. But she hadn't noticed that either because apparently in our house, my presence had become an emotional inconvenience, background noise to someone else's symphony, the technical difficulties screen that pops up between the programming people actually want to watch. I cleaned up the kitchen at 11, blew out the candle stubs that had witnessed my humiliation, and went to bed next to a woman who was still glowing in the dark from her phone screen, still engaged in conversations that mattered more than anything I could say. That night, staring at our ceiling while she giggled softly at something Lucas said, I made a decision that would change everything. I stopped trying to fix things, stopped hoping she'd wake up and remember she had a husband, and started planning my exit strategy with the same careful logistics I used at work. If I was already a ghost in my own home, I might as well become one officially. At least ghosts get to haunt people. I was just being ignored. I've always been the kind of guy who believes in communication, in talking things through like reasonable adults who graduated from high school and theoretically learned how to process emotions without just screaming or throwing things or posting cryptic Facebook statuses that make everyone wonder if you're okay. My parents were big on the whole use your words philosophy, probably because my dad once punched a hole in the drywall during an argument about whose turn it was to take out the trash and spent the next 3 weekends learning how to patch drywall, while my mother lectured him about emotional regulation. So I grew up thinking that if you had a problem with someone, you sat down, you explained how you felt using those sacred I statements that therapists and corporate HR training videos love so much, and you worked toward a solution like civilized human beings. I've listened to enough podcasts during my commute to know all the terminology: active listening, emotional validation, creating safe spaces for vulnerability, all that stuff. That sounds great in theory, but tends to fall apart when one person is more interested in their phone than their marriage. So the week after the movie night disaster, after I'd spent 7 days replaying that humiliating evening in my head like a highlight reel of my failures as a husband, I decided to try one more time. I was going to communicate. I was going to be vulnerable. I was going to use every healthy relationship technique I'd absorbed from podcasts with names like Unlocking Intimacy and The Conscious Couple and Why Your Marriage Sucks and How to Fix It Before You End Up Divorced and Lonely. I waited until Maya was asleep, until the apartment was quiet except for the constant buzzing of Tara's phone, which had become like white noise at this point, and I approached my wife with the solemnity of a man about to defuse a bomb while following instructions from a manual written in a language he doesn't quite understand. Hey, can we talk? I asked him, sitting down next to her on the couch where she was. Surprise, surprise. Scrolling through her phone with the intensity of someone searching for the cure to cancer in a group chat. She looked up, and I could see the flicker of annoyance cross her face, that micro-expression that said, I was interrupting something important, which probably meant Lucas was in the middle of explaining his feelings about his ex, or Trent was having a breakthrough about his business strategy, or Eli had found a new way to mourn his cat that required immediate emotional support. Sure, she said in the tone people use when they're agreeing to something they absolutely don't want to do. What's up? I took a breath, channeled every communication guru I'd ever heard, and started with the classic opener. I feel ignored. Simple, direct, non-accusatory. Starting with I instead of you, because apparently saying, you ignore me constantly, and I'm pretty sure you care more about your phone friends than your actual husband, would be considered aggressive. I watched Tara's face for recognition, for understanding, for any sign that what I just said had penetrated the force field of digital distraction that surrounded her like some kind of anti-intimacy bubble. Instead, she blinked at me like I'd just spoken ancient Greek, like I'd said something so incomprehensible that her brain needed a moment to process whether I was having a stroke or just being weird. Are you jealous? She asked, and I swear to God, the way she said it made it sound like I'd just admitted to something embarrassing, like I'd confessed to being afraid of butterflies or collecting toenail clippings. They're my friends. Derek, my friends, I'm allowed to have friends. She said it with this edge of defensiveness that immediately put me on the back foot, like I was the one being unreasonable, like wanting to spend time with my wife without her phone as a third party, was some kind of controlling, possessive behavior that needed to be called out and shamed. I could feel the conversation already slipping away from me, could sense that my carefully planned attempt at healthy communication was about to get derailed by the fact that in modern discourse, any complaint about your partner's behavior can be immediately reframed as you being the problem. I'm not saying you can't have friends, I said, trying to keep my voice calm and level, trying not to sound like the jealous husband she was already accusing me of being. I just want some time without the phone, like actual time where we're both present, both here, both paying attention to each other instead of. I gestured vaguely at her phone, which had buzzed twice during this conversation already, and I could see her eyes flicking toward it like a smoker eyeing a cigarette after being told they're in a no smoking zone. Instead of what? She interrupted. Instead of me having a support system? Instead of me having people I can talk to about my life? The implication was clear. I wasn't part of her support system anymore. I wasn't someone she talked to about her life. I was the person complaining about her actual support system. The buzzkill who didn't understand that modern friendship requires constant digital contact, and that maybe if I was more interesting or more emotionally available or more something, she wouldn't need to seek connection elsewhere. That's not what I'm saying, I tried again, feeling like I was trying to grab smoke with my bare hands. I'm saying that when we're together, when we're trying to have dinner or watch a movie or just exist in the same space, it would be nice if you weren't constantly texting other people. Is that really so unreasonable? Tara's expression shifted then, from defensive to something worse, condescending pity. She looked at me the way you'd look at a child who's upset that they can't have ice cream for breakfast. Like my feelings were cute, but ultimately misguided and not worth taking seriously. That's controlling, Derek, she said, and I felt something cold settle in my stomach. You're acting like my dad. Like you get to decide when I can use my phone and who I can talk to and when I'm allowed to have my own life separate from you. That's not healthy. That's not what marriage is supposed to be. I sat there stunned, because somehow my attempt to ask for basic attention and presence in my own marriage had been twisted into me being controlling, possessive, and unhealthy. Somewhere in the translation from my brain to her ears, I'd like you to be present when we're together, had become, I want to isolate you from your friends and control your every move. I thought about saying what I was really thinking, which was, well, your dad wouldn't have tolerated 3 men texting his wife at 2 in the morning either. And maybe that's not controlling. Maybe that's just called having standards for what a marriage looks like. But I didn't say it because I could already see that this conversation was over, that I'd lost before I'd even started, that there was no combination of words or I statements or healthy communication techniques that were going to make her see what was happening to us. Instead, I just smiled. Not a real smile, but the kind of smile you give when you've accepted defeat. When you've realized that the person sitting across from you isn't interested in understanding your perspective, and any further attempt to explain yourself will just dig you deeper into the hole you're already standing in. You're right, I said, because sometimes surrender looks like agreement. I'm sorry. Tara nodded, satisfied that I'd seen the error of my ways and immediately picked up her phone to respond to whatever message she'd been dying to answer for the past 3 minutes. The conversation was over. I'd tried to communicate, and all I'd gotten for my trouble was being diagnosed as controlling and compared to her father, who I'm pretty sure would have thrown her phone out a window by now. She must have sensed that I wasn't quite satisfied with how things had ended, because she looked back up at me with this expression of benevolent patience and delivered the final blow. You need to work on your insecurities, Derek. This jealousy thing isn't attractive, and honestly, it's kind of exhausting for me to deal with. Maybe you should talk to someone about it. And there it was, the ultimate reversal, the conversational Aikido move that took my legitimate complaint about being ignored in my own marriage and transformed it into my personal failing, my psychological problem, my insecurity that I needed to work on. Preferably with a professional who could help me understand that wanting your wife to look at you occasionally was actually a sign of deep-seated emotional issues that I should probably address before they got worse. That was the night I stopped trying to fix things, not because I didn't care anymore, but because I finally understood that you can't fix something when the other person doesn't think it's broken. Tara didn't see a problem with her behavior because, from her perspective, she was just maintaining friendships and practicing self-care and living her best life. And if her husband couldn't handle that, well, that was his issue to work through, not hers. I nodded, told her I'd think about what she said, and went to bed knowing that my next conversation wasn't going to be about our marriage. It was going to be about my exit strategy. because apparently the only thing I'd gotten promoted to that night was the position of problem husband, and I was ready to tender my resignation. Life has this weird way of giving you exactly what you need right when you've stopped believing in cosmic timing or divine intervention or any of that motivational poster nonsense about things happening for a reason. 2 days after my disastrous attempt at healthy communication, the conversation where I got labeled as controlling, jealous, and in desperate need of therapy for the crime of wanting my wife to occasionally acknowledge my existence. I was sitting in my office at work, stress eating a protein bar that tasted like compressed sadness and artificially flavored disappointment, when my boss, Frank Morales, knocked on my door frame and asked if I had a minute. Frank's one of those guys who climbed the corporate ladder by actually being competent instead of just talking a good game in meetings, which is rare enough in logistics management that I genuinely respected him, even if he did have a tendency to forward motivational emails with subject lines like, "Excellence is a journey, not a destination," that made me want to throw my computer out the window. "Close the door," Frank said, which immediately made my anxiety spike because in corporate America, close the door either means you're getting fired or something significant is about to happen. And given that I'd been doing my job with the mechanical efficiency of someone who desperately needed the distraction from his imploding personal life, I was pretty sure I wasn't getting fired. He sat down across from my desk, which was covered in shipping manifests and inventory reports and about 17 coffee cups in various stages of abandonment, and gave me this look that I couldn't quite read, part serious, part excited, like he was about to tell me something important, but wasn't sure how I'd react. "How do you feel about Texas?" he asked, and I genuinely thought he was making small talk or about to tell me we'd landed some big client in Dallas or Houston, and would I mind handling the logistics coordination from here. "It's fine, I guess," I said, because what else do you say when your boss randomly brings up a state you've never really thought about beyond knowing that they have good barbecue and an unfortunate attachment to the Dallas Cowboys? "Big place, lots of cattle. Why?" Frank leaned back in his chair, and I could see he was enjoying this. Enjoying having information I didn't have. Enjoying the dramatic buildup to whatever announcement he was about to make. "We're opening a new operations center in Austin." Dead-eyed. Bigger facility, newer equipment, managing distribution for the entire Southwest region. It's a major expansion, and we need someone to run it. Someone who knows our systems, understands our culture, and can handle the complexity of setting up a facility from scratch while maintaining operational efficiency. I want that someone to be you. I sat there for a solid 10 seconds, my brain trying to process what he'd just said while simultaneously calculating what this could mean for my life, my marriage, my daughter, my current situation that felt like slowly drowning in a pool of domestic misery while my wife texted from the poolside. "You want me to move to Texas?" I asked, just to make sure I'd heard him correctly and wasn't hallucinating due to stress and lack of sleep. "And run the new facility?" Frank nodded, pulling out a folder that had clearly been prepared in advance, which meant this wasn't a spontaneous offer, but something he'd been planning, something he'd already discussed with corporate, something real. "Director of Operations, Southwest Region," he said, sliding the folder across my desk. 30% pay increase, relocation bonus that'll cover your moving expenses plus some, company apartment for the first 6 months while you get settled, full benefits package. And honestly, Derek, this is the kind of position that sets you up for VP track if you want it. I opened the folder and saw numbers that made my current salary look like what I made during my first internship out of college. I saw organizational charts that put my name at the top, saw descriptions of responsibilities that were simultaneously terrifying and exciting, saw a relocation timeline that had me starting in 6 weeks, which was both incredibly fast and somehow exactly the time frame I needed to extract myself from a situation that was killing me slowly from the inside. "This is a huge opportunity," Frank continued, clearly interpreting my silence as hesitation rather than the mental calculation of whether I could escape my marriage with corporate approval and a pay raise. "I know it's a big move, especially with your family, but Austin's a great city, good schools, lower cost of living than here, and honestly, the weather's not bad if you can handle the heat. Take the folder home, talk to your wife, think about it, and let me know by the end of the week. But between you and me, I really hope you say yes because, you're the best logistics manager I've got, and this facility needs someone who won't screw it up." When do I start? I said. And Frank blinked, clearly not expecting me to basically accept on the spot, without the customary period of deliberation and family discussion that normal people engage in before making life-altering decisions. Well, like I said, talk to your wife first, he laughed, thinking I was just being enthusiastic rather than desperately clinging to this offer like a life raft that had just been thrown to someone who'd been treading water in shark-infested seas for the past 6 months. This is a family decision, not just a career move. Make sure everyone's on board. I nodded, picked up the folder, and said all the right things about considering it carefully and discussing it with Tara and weighing all the factors. But inside my head, I was already gone. I was already in Texas, already setting up a new life, already imagining what it would feel like to wake up in a place where nobody was constantly texting 3 other men while I folded laundry and questioned my worth as a human being. I took the folder home that evening with this weird mixture of excitement and dread churning in my stomach. Part of me genuinely wanted to discuss this with Tara, like Frank had suggested, to sit down and have a real conversation about whether this move made sense for our family, whether the opportunities outweighed the challenges of relocating, whether we could use this as a chance to reset our marriage in a new city where she didn't have established friend groups and maybe, just maybe, would remember she had a husband. The other part of me, the part that was growing louder and more insistent with each passing day, knew exactly how that conversation would go. She'd be scrolling through her phone while I explained the opportunity. She'd give me half her attention while texting Lucas or Trent or Eli about something infinitely more interesting than her husband's career advancement. And she'd ultimately say something like, I can't just leave my friends, or Maya's settled here, or this seems really sudden, while never once considering that maybe, just maybe, a fresh start was exactly what we needed. I got home at 6:30, walked into our apartment, and found Tara in her usual position on the couch, phone in hand, that familiar glow illuminating her face like she was communing with something sacred. Hey, I said, setting down my briefcase and holding the folder like it contained nuclear launch codes. I need to talk to you about something. Frank offered me a position in Texas. Director level, big promotion, significant raise. It's a really good opportunity for us. I placed the folder on the coffee table between us, right in her line of sight, impossible to ignore. She glanced at it, then back at her phone, and I watched her fingers continue typing. Like what I just said was background noise, elevator music, something to acknowledge but not actually engage with. That's nice, babe, she said, not looking up. When would it start? I explained the timeline, the benefits, the potential for our future, and watched as approximately 0% of this information penetrated whatever conversation she was currently having that was clearly more important than discussing whether we should move halfway across the country. 20 minutes passed. She laughed at something on her screen, actually laughed out loud, and said to her phone, not to me, oh my God, Eli, you're such a good listener. I don't know what I'd do without you. That's when I knew. That's when I understood with absolute clarity that she'd already made her choice, that her friends were more important than our future, that no amount of money or opportunity or fresh starts would matter because she was perfectly happy right here, right now, living her life through a screen while her husband became increasingly irrelevant. I picked up the folder, the physical representation of my escape plan that I'd briefly considered sharing with her, like we were still a team, and said, never mind. She didn't even notice. She was too busy being someone's emotional support system, too busy consoling Eli over his dead cat, who at this point I was convinced had faked his own death just to get attention from gullible women who couldn't see manipulation when it was texting them at midnight. What? Tara asked absently, still not looking up. Nothing, I said. It's not important. And in that moment, standing in my own living room, holding a folder that could change my entire life, I made my decision. She'd already chosen her priorities, and I wasn't on the list. So I quietly, privately accepted the job. Texas was about to become my witness protection program, my escape route, my chance to disappear from a marriage where I'd already become invisible anyway. Here's something they don't tell you about being a logistics manager. All those skills you develop for efficiently moving cargo from point A to point B, tracking shipments, managing inventory, and coordinating complex operations without anyone noticing the behind-the-scenes chaos, those skills translate remarkably well to dismantling your entire life and preparing to vanish from your marriage without your wife noticing because she's too busy texting her emotional support boy band. I've spent the last 8 years optimizing supply chains, streamlining distribution networks, and making sure thousands of packages arrive at their destinations on time and intact. So planning my own disappearance felt less like an emotional crisis and more like just another project that required careful planning, attention to detail, and the ability to execute multiple tasks simultaneously while maintaining operational security. If I was going to do this, I was going to do it right, which meant Tara wouldn't know I was leaving until I was already gone, and she tried to use the credit card that suddenly didn't work. The day after I accepted Frank's offer, which I did via email at 11 o'clock at night while Tara giggled at her phone in bed next to me, presumably because Lucas had finally achieved some breakthrough in his recovery from his devastating breakup, I started what I mentally referred to as Operation Vanish. Phase 1 was reconnaissance and planning, which involved taking inventory of everything I owned, everything we jointly owned, and everything I'd need to establish a new life in Texas without raising any red flags that might alert Tara to the fact that her husband was systematically preparing to ghost her like she was a bad Tinder date. I made lists during my lunch breaks, spreadsheets on my work computer that I'd immediately close whenever someone walked past my office, mental calculations of what I could take, what I'd have to leave behind, and what needed to disappear gradually enough that nobody would notice until it was too late to stop me. Phase 2 was execution, and this is where my professional expertise really shined. I started by renting a storage unit on the other side of town, one of those climate-controlled facilities where people store their dead relatives' furniture and Christmas decorations they'll never use again. I paid cash, used my work address on the paperwork, and got a unit in the back corner where nobody would see me coming and going. Then I began the careful, methodical process of moving my life out of our apartment in increments small enough that Tara, who I swear could tell you exactly how many unread messages she had across 4 different group chats, but couldn't tell you what color our bathroom towels were, would never notice. I started with things that had been in closets or boxes anyway. Old college textbooks, winter clothes I wouldn't need until I was already gone, tools I'd bought for home improvement projects I never finished because I was too busy being ignored. Every few days, I'd pack a box, tape it up, and drop it at the storage unit on my way to or from work. Simple, efficient, completely invisible as someone who was paying attention to literally everything except her husband. The beauty of being married to someone who's permanently attached to their phone is that they stop noticing physical reality almost entirely. I could have moved an entire sofa out of our apartment piece by piece, and as long as Tara had somewhere to sit with her phone, she'd never register that the furniture was different. I tested this theory by removing a framed photo of us from our wedding, one of those pictures where we both looked genuinely happy and in love, back before group chats and emotional support networks and dead cats became more important than actual human connection, and replacing it with a similar-sized frame containing a motivational quote I printed from the internet that said, "Live, laugh, love," in that insufferable script font that middle-aged women love. 3 weeks passed. Tara never mentioned it. Never noticed that our wedding photo, which had hung in our living room for 6 years, had been swapped out for generic Pinterest inspiration that you'd find in a home goods clearance section. That's when I knew I could take whatever I wanted and she'd never see it because she wasn't actually looking at our life anymore. She was looking at her screen. Next went my clothes. Not all at once, obviously, because even Tara might notice if my entire wardrobe suddenly disappeared. But gradually, systematically, over the course of 3 weeks. I'd pack up 2 or 3 suits, a few shirts, some casual clothes, and ferry them to the storage unit. I kept enough rotation of outfits that it looked like I still had a full closet. But really, about 70% of my wardrobe was already in Austin, metaphorically speaking. My books went next. Not that Tara had ever asked about my reading habits or noticed the small library I'd accumulated over the years, but I felt some weird sentimentality about my collection of Tom Clancy novels and business books with titles like Extreme Ownership and The Lean Startup that I'd bought thinking they'd help me be successful, but really just collected dust while teaching me nothing about how to handle a wife who preferred digital communication with strangers over actual conversation with her husband. The personal items were trickier, more emotionally loaded, but also easier to move because they were smaller, and Tara had stopped caring about my inner life approximately around the same time she discovered that male attention was available on demand through her phone. Photos of my parents, my grandfather's watch, the cufflinks I wore at our wedding, Maya's baby photos that I'd carefully organized in albums because I was apparently the only parent who thought preserving memories in physical form mattered. All of it went into boxes labeled office supplies that I stacked in my car and transported to the storage unit. I even managed to get my gaming console out, which had been gathering dust anyway, since I'd stopped having leisure time and started spending my evenings watching my wife court digital relationships, while I contemplated whether this was just modern marriage, or whether I was living in some kind of psychological torture experiment designed to test how much neglect a human being could tolerate before they snapped. Maya noticed more than her mother did, which tells you everything you need to know about the state of our household. "Daddy, where's your blue sweater?" she asked one morning while I was making her breakfast, another task that apparently fell solely to me since Tara was usually too busy checking her phone to participate in morning routines. "At the cleaners, sweetheart," I lied, feeling guilty because I try not to lie to my daughter, but also recognizing that Daddy's secretly moving to Texas because Mommy loves her phone more than our family wasn't really appropriate breakfast conversation for a 7-year-old. She accepted this explanation with the trust that children have in their parents, and I made a mental note that when this was all over, when the dust settled and the divorce papers were filed and custody arrangements were negotiated, I'd need to have a real conversation with Maya about what happened and why. And I'd need to do it in a way that didn't make her mother the villain, even though Tara was absolutely the villain in this particular story. The financial preparations were the most crucial and the most dangerous, because money always gets people's attention in ways that missing picture frames and disappearing sweaters don't. I couldn't just drain our joint account without Tara noticing, but I could gradually redirect my direct deposit, which I did by setting up a new checking account at a different bank and slowly shifting the percentage of my paycheck that went there versus the joint account we shared. Started at 20%, then 30, then 50, timing it with pay raises and bonuses that Tara never asked about because she'd stopped caring about our financial situation around the same time she'd stopped caring about our emotional situation. I paid down my personal credit card, made sure all my work expenses were reimbursed directly to my new account, and essentially created a parallel financial life that existed completely independently of our shared finances. By the time I left, I'd have enough money to cover first and last month's rent on an apartment, furnish a new place, and support myself comfortably while the lawyers figured out how to divide assets with a woman who probably wouldn't notice we were getting divorced until her spa day got declined. The lease termination was handled through my company, which agreed to take over the remaining months of our apartment rental as part of my relocation package, which meant Tara would eventually get a notice that the lease wasn't being renewed, but by then I'd be gone, and she could deal with it however she wanted. I updated my address with the DMV, my insurance companies, my credit cards, and every other institution that needed to know where I'd be living, leaving our joint address only for things that would give away my plan if changed too early. I scheduled the movers for a week before my official start date in Austin, coordinated with Frank to have my new company apartment ready, and arranged for my car to be serviced and prepped for the drive because the last thing I needed was to break down somewhere in rural Oklahoma while fleeing my marriage like I was in a witness protection program. Even Maya started saying things that broke my heart and strengthened my resolve simultaneously. "Mom's always busy helping her phone friends," she said one night during our bedtime routine, which had become our special time together, since Tara had essentially checked out of parenting duties unless they could be performed while texting. Does she love them more than us? I wanted to say no. Wanted to protect her from the reality that her mother had traded her family for validation from strangers. But I also couldn't lie to those big, trusting eyes that looked at me like I had all the answers. "Your mom loves you very much," I said carefully. "She just gets distracted sometimes." Maya nodded like this made sense, and I tucked her in and promised her a trip soon. That trip being her visits to Austin, our new life, our fresh start where maybe, just maybe, she'd learn that relationships don't have to involve competing with technology for someone's attention. Every step I took felt lighter, like I was deleting corrupted files from a computer system that had been running slowly for months. With each box I moved, each account I separated, each piece of my old life I systematically dismantled, I felt less like a husband who'd failed and more like someone who'd finally figured out that you can't save a marriage when only one person thinks it's worth saving. Tara never noticed any of it because she'd already left our marriage emotionally months ago. I was just catching up physically. 3 weeks, 2 days, and approximately 6 hours after I'd initiated Operation Vanish. Yeah, I was tracking it that precisely because when you're dismantling your entire life, you tend to become hyper aware of time passing. Everything was ready. My storage unit was packed with boxes labeled and inventoried like I was running a small warehouse operation, which I guess I was. My new bank account had enough money to sustain me through the transition and then some, thanks to that generous relocation bonus that Frank had somehow convinced corporate to approve. My company apartment in Austin was ready for occupancy, complete with furniture rental that would arrive the day after I did, because even in my escape plan, I was maintaining operational efficiency. The movers were scheduled for the following Monday to transport everything from my storage unit to Texas, which meant I had exactly one weekend to execute the final phase of my plan, leaving without actually having to have a conversation about leaving. Because at this point, I'd used up my lifetime quota of trying to communicate with someone who thought my feelings were a personal inconvenience. I took Friday off work, told Tara I had a business trip to check out the new facility in Austin, which wasn't technically a lie since I was going to Austin and it was business related, just permanently. And she barely looked up from her phone when I mentioned it. "That's nice. Have fun," she said, in that tone people use when they're acknowledging you spoke but didn't actually process any of the words you said. She was mid-conversation with someone, probably Lucas, who'd apparently moved on from his devastating breakup to a new relationship that also required my wife's constant emotional investment and commentary. And I stood there with my suitcase packed like I was going away for a few days instead of forever, waiting to see if she'd ask a single follow-up question. "When do you leave? How long will you be gone? Will you call Maya before bed?" Any of these would have been normal things for a spouse to ask, but Tara just returned to her phone, and I realized she probably wouldn't notice I was gone until Monday at the earliest, maybe longer if Lucas or Trent or the reincarnated spirit of Eli's cat kept her sufficiently entertained. I said goodbye to Maya that morning before school, giving her an extra long hug that probably confused her because I'm not usually the overly emotional type, but I needed that moment, needed to hold my daughter and promise myself that this wasn't abandoning her. This was showing her that people don't have to accept being treated like they're invisible. "Love you, kiddo," I said, smoothing down her hair that always stuck up in the back, no matter how much we tried to tame it. "Love you too, Daddy," she said, grabbing her backpack and heading out the door with Tara, who was already back on her phone before they'd even made it to the elevator. I watched them go, closed the door, took one last look at the apartment that had been my home for 6 years, but had stopped feeling like home the moment my wife decided that digital connection was more important than the physical presence of her family, and I left. The drive to Austin took 14 hours with stops, which gave me plenty of time to think, to question whether I was doing the right thing, to imagine all the ways this could blow up in my face, and to ultimately conclude that staying would have killed something essential in me, that I wasn't willing to sacrifice just to maintain the illusion of a marriage that had already ended months ago. I checked into my company apartment at 9 p.m., collapsed on the unfamiliar bed in the unfurnished bedroom, and for the first time in recent memory, I slept through the night without waking up to the sound of my wife giggling at her phone like a teenager at a sleepover. The next morning, Saturday, I sent the text that would officially end my marriage. "Starting my new role today. Take care." 6 words. No explanation, no location, no drama. Just a simple statement of fact that I was moving forward with my life and she could figure out the rest on her own time. I didn't include my new address. I didn't explain that starting my new role meant I'd accepted a position in Texas and had already relocated my entire life while she'd been too busy texting to notice. I didn't outline the grievances or list the ways she'd neglected our marriage, or try one more time to make her understand how lonely I'd been sitting next to her while she laughed at other men's jokes. I just sent the text, turned off my phone for the rest of the weekend because I wasn't ready to deal with whatever response might come, and focused on the task of setting up my new life in a city where nobody knew me as the guy whose wife preferred her phone to his company. It felt simultaneously liberating and terrifying, like jumping out of an airplane and trusting that the parachute would open, except the parachute was my own ability to rebuild a life from scratch, and I wasn't entirely sure I'd packed it correctly. The irony, and oh, there was so much irony in this situation that it could probably be mined and sold as a natural resource, was that Tara didn't even respond for 2 days. 2 full days passed, where apparently my text announcing that I'd started a new role, which any reasonable person would have questions about, just sat there unacknowledged while she continued her regularly scheduled programming of texting Lucas, Trent, and whoever else had replaced actual human relationships in her life. I turned my phone back on Sunday night, expecting to see a barrage of missed calls and frantic messages, but instead found nothing. Complete radio silence. Either she hadn't seen the text, which seemed unlikely given that her phone was basically a permanently attached appendage, or she'd seen it and didn't care enough to respond, which was actually worse than not seeing it because it confirmed everything I'd suspected about my importance in her life. But Monday morning, approximately 48 hours after my departure, reality finally penetrated the bubble of digital distraction that Tara had been living in for the past year. My sister Lauren called me, laughing so hard she could barely speak, and said, "Oh my God, Derek, your wife just called me freaking out because her credit card got declined. What did you do?" I felt a smile spread across my face, the first genuine smile I'd experienced in months. "I left," I said simply. "Moved to Texas for work. Separated our finances. She's on her own now." Lauren, who'd been watching my marriage deteriorate from the outside and had tactfully avoided saying, "I told you so," every time I complained about Tara's phone addiction, let out a whoop of approval. "Tell me everything," she demanded, and I explained the whole operation while she alternated between impressed silence and outbursts of laughter at the sheer audacity of vanishing from your marriage while your wife was too distracted to notice. Apparently, what finally made Tara realize something was wrong wasn't my cryptic text message or my sudden absence or the fact that her husband hadn't been home in 3 days. No, what triggered her awareness that her life had fundamentally changed was trying to book a spa appointment at some overpriced wellness center that charged $200 for a massage and a facial, and having her credit card declined at checkout. Not once, but twice, because she probably thought the first decline was a mistake and tried again, imagining there was some kind of technical error rather than the reality that her access to joint funds had been severed, like I was cutting the cord on a parasite that had been draining resources while providing nothing in return. The spa receptionist probably stood there awkwardly while Tara swiped her card multiple times, each declined transaction another nail in the coffin of her oblivious existence, until she finally had to accept that something was very, very wrong. That's when the calls started. That's when suddenly, after 2 days of complete silence, I became important again. My phone started blowing up with messages, each one more frantic than the last. "What happened? Where are you? Why isn't the card working? We need to talk. Derek, answer your phone. This isn't funny. What did you do?" I watched them come in, one after another, notifications piling up like evidence in a trial, where I was both the prosecution and the defense, and I didn't reply to a single one. Not because I was being cruel or petty, okay, maybe a little petty, but because I genuinely had nothing left to say to her. I'd tried talking, I'd tried communicating, I'd tried explaining how I felt and what I needed, and I'd been dismissed, labeled as controlling and jealous and insecure, told I needed to work on my issues while she continued prioritizing digital strangers over her actual husband. So now when she finally wanted to talk because her financial security was threatened, when she finally noticed I existed because my absence affected her lifestyle, I chose silence. I chose to let her experience exactly what I'd been experiencing for months. The feeling of reaching out to someone and getting nothing back. I didn't reply, but I did allow myself a moment of satisfaction imagining the scene. Tara standing at the spa reception desk, her card declined, her phone out to text Lucas or Trent about this bizarre situation where her husband seemed to have done something to their finances, maybe asking them for advice or emotional support about this inconvenience that had interrupted her self-care routine. The spa receptionist probably suggested she call her bank, and Tara probably did, only to discover that the joint account she'd taken for granted still existed, but the direct deposits that funded it had been redirected elsewhere. I pictured her explaining to the cashier, who definitely didn't get paid enough to care about other people's marital drama, that there must be some mistake, that her husband handles the finances, that she needed to figure out what was going on before she could pay for services that she'd probably already received. Because that's how spas work. You get the massage and facial first, then deal with payment after you're already relaxed and glowing. The image of Tara trying to explain to a minimum wage spa employee that her self-care had just been repossessed by her invisible husband made me laugh out loud in my empty apartment in Austin. A sound that echoed off the bare walls and reminded me that I was alone now, truly alone, but in a way that felt clean and honest, rather than the suffocating loneliness of being ignored by someone who was supposed to love you. Her card declined, her spa day ruined. Her perfect little world of digital connections and emotional support networks suddenly disrupted by the inconvenient reality that someone had been funding her lifestyle while she'd been taking them for granted. It wasn't revenge exactly. It was consequences. It was reality finally catching up to someone who'd been living in a fantasy where actions didn't have repercussions and husbands were just NPCs in the background of your real life happening on your phone. The thing about executing a perfect disappearing act is that you don't get to witness the fallout in real time, which is both a blessing and a mild disappointment because while I didn't want to engage with the chaos I'd left behind, there was a small, petty part of me that wanted front row seats to watch Tara's world implode when she finally realized that her emotional support husband had permanently logged off. Fortunately for my curiosity and unfortunately for Tara's dignity, my sister Lauren became my eyes and ears back home, feeding me updates with the enthusiasm of someone live tweeting a reality show meltdown. Lauren had never particularly liked Tara, not in an aggressive way, but in that subtle way sisters have, of knowing when their brother's wife isn't treating him right and biting their tongue at family dinners while mentally cataloging grievances for future reference. Now that I'd finally done something about my situation, Lauren had apparently decided that discretion was no longer necessary and was more than happy to serve as my intelligence operative in enemy territory. So get this, Lauren called me on Tuesday evening, her voice crackling with barely suppressed glee. Tara showed up at Mom and Dad's house yesterday looking for you, just rolled up unannounced, which you know Mom hates, and demanded to know where you were and what was going on. Mom told her she had no idea what Tara was talking about, which was technically true since I hadn't filled them in on Operation Vanish yet, and Tara literally had a meltdown in the driveway. Full-on crying, mascara running, the whole performance. Said you'd abandoned her without warning, that you'd destroyed your family, that she couldn't believe you'd just leave without any explanation. I leaned back in my desk chair at my new office. Yes, I was already at work because diving into a new role was infinitely preferable to sitting alone with my thoughts, and tried to process the audacity of someone who'd emotionally abandoned their marriage months ago, now claiming to be the victim of abandonment. Did she mention the part where she spent the last year ignoring me in favor of her phone? I asked, already knowing the answer. Lauren snorted. Oh no. That little detail didn't make it into her victim narrative. According to Tara's version of events, you just suddenly decided to blow up your marriage for no reason, move to another state without discussion, and cut her off financially like some kind of monster. She's telling everyone you had a mental breakdown or a midlife crisis. Lucas is apparently very concerned about your psychological state. The mention of Lucas made my blood pressure spike in a way that probably wasn't healthy, but I forced myself to breathe through it because getting angry about my wife's emotional support pen pal wasn't going to change anything. Of course he is, I said. I'm sure he's being very supportive during this difficult time for her. Really stepping up with those late-night texts and emotional validation. But the updates that truly satisfied that petty part of my soul came over the following weeks. As Lauren reported with almost journalistic dedication on the systematic collapse of Tara's support network. Turns out, when you're no longer the center of an entertaining drama, when your life stops being a source of engaging content for your digital friends, people tend to lose interest pretty quickly. Lucas, the supposedly devastated, heartbroken, sensitive soul who needed constant emotional support, got engaged to a woman named Emma approximately 3 weeks after I left. Lauren sent me screenshots of the announcement that Tara had apparently posted in some group chat, complete with Tara's message saying, "So happy for you," with enough exclamation points to suggest she was actually having a stroke. Lucas getting engaged meant he no longer needed Tara's nightly counseling sessions about his feelings and his journey and his healing process, which meant 1/3 of her emotional support network had just ghosted her for someone who was actually willing to date him instead of just text him while married to someone else. Trent was next to vanish from Tara's digital ecosystem. Mr. I need advice on my business. Apparently got a job offer in Seattle at a real company with a real salary, which meant his imaginary consulting business and his constant need for guidance from a dental hygienist about brand management strategies had either been completely fabricated or had failed so spectacularly that he'd given up and joined the corporate world like a normal person. He moved to Seattle without much fanfare. And according to Lauren's intelligence gathering, Tara found out about it through a mutual friend rather than from Trent directly, which suggested that their deep connection and meaningful friendship wasn't quite as deep or meaningful as Tara had convinced herself it was. Trent stopped responding to messages, stopped engaging in group chats, and basically disappeared into his new life in the Pacific Northwest, where presumably he'd find some other lonely married woman to manipulate into thinking his problems were interesting. And then there was Eli. Poor, grief-stricken Eli, who'd lost his beloved cat and needed so much emotional support that it had nearly destroyed my marriage. Plot twist that surprised absolutely no one who'd been paying attention. Eli found a new therapist about a month after I left. Except this therapist was a 26-year-old woman named Brianna, who apparently didn't know she was joining a franchise operation of women who thought they were special because Eli shared his feelings with them. Lauren discovered this through some Instagram deep diving that she insisted was just casual scrolling, but was definitely more like FBI-level surveillance, and sent me photos of Eli and Brianna looking very cozy at various restaurants and events, with no visible signs of the devastating grief that had supposedly rendered him unable to function without my wife's constant text-based emotional support. The dead cat, whose name I still refuse to learn, had apparently been avenged or forgotten, or possibly never existed in the first place. And Eli had moved on to his next target with the efficiency of a predator who'd identified easier prey. The beautiful, karmic, absolutely perfect irony of the whole situation was that Tara's emotional support trio vanished one by one precisely when she actually needed emotional support, right when her own life was falling apart, and she could have used some of that friendship and connection she'd prioritized over her marriage. But apparently, those deep bonds and meaningful relationships were only meaningful when Tara was the one providing support, when she was the hero in someone else's story, when her involvement made her feel needed and important and special. The moment she became the one in crisis, the one who needed help, the one whose marriage had imploded and whose husband had disappeared, her support network evaporated like it had never existed in the first place. Lucas stopped responding once he had a fiancée who probably didn't appreciate him maintaining intense text relationships with other women. Trent stopped needing advice once he had actual coworkers and a real job structure. Eli stopped sharing his grief once he had a new woman to manipulate with his sensitive guy routine. Lauren reported that Tara was in full chaos mode, calling mutual friends and family members, trying to figure out where I was and how to fix this situation. But the responses she got weren't exactly sympathetic. Most people, it turned out, had noticed the phone addiction and the constant texting and the way she'd checked out of her marriage, even if they'd been too polite to say anything at the time. Now that the consequences had arrived, now that her behavior had driven her husband to literally flee the state, people were less inclined to support her victim narrative and more inclined to point out that maybe, just maybe, she should have put down her phone occasionally and paid attention to her actual family. My mother, bless her blunt Italian heart, apparently told Tara that she'd made her bed and now had to lie in it, which is the kind of old-school wisdom that doesn't leave room for excuses or justifications. My dad just shook his head and said he'd seen it coming, which was comforting in a "why didn't you warn me" kind of way, but also validating because it meant I wasn't crazy for feeling neglected. The friend group that Tara and I had shared as a couple mostly sided with me once they heard the full story. Not because I was campaigning for support, but because the truth was pretty obvious to anyone who'd spent time around us in the last year. They'd watched her ignore me at dinners, seen her text through movie nights, witnessed her prioritize her phone over every social interaction we'd attended. One friend, Marcus, told Lauren that he'd stopped inviting us to things because Tara's constant phone use made everyone uncomfortable, and he felt bad watching me sit there like a ghost at my own social events. Another couple, Jessica and Tom, admitted they'd had conversations about whether they should say something to Tara about her behavior, but decided it wasn't their place to interfere in our marriage, which I appreciated, even if it would have been nice to know I wasn't the only one who thought the situation was insane. But the call that really made me laugh, the one that Lauren delivered with the dramatic timing of someone who'd been saving the best story for last, came about 6 weeks after I'd left. Tara had apparently been crying to anyone who would listen about how I'd abandoned her, how she couldn't believe I'd just leave without trying to work things out, how she was so confused about what had gone wrong. And then, in a moment of clarity that must have required significant courage, Lauren had finally had enough of Tara's selective amnesia and revisionist history. "I told her," Lauren said, her voice mixing pride with slight concern about whether she'd overstepped. "I told her that you didn't abandon her. I told her she abandoned you months ago. She just never looked up from her phone long enough to notice. I said you tried to talk to her, tried to fix things, tried to get her attention, and she called you controlling and told you to work on your insecurities. I told her she made her choice, and now she's mad that you finally accepted it and moved on. The silence on Tara's end, according to Lauren, had been deafening. No argument, no defense, no explanation, just silence. Because what could she possibly say? The truth was the truth, and no amount of spinning or reframing or playing the victim could change the fact that she'd traded her marriage for group chats and lost both in the end. Her friends had stopped replying once the drama wasn't entertaining anymore, once they'd gotten what they needed from her, and moved on to their next sources of attention and validation. Suddenly, self-care felt a lot like solitude. Except solitude by choice is peaceful, and solitude by consequence is just lonely. Tara was discovering the hard way that digital connections aren't a substitute for real relationships, that you can't build a life on text messages and emojis, that the people who encourage you to neglect your family in the name of personal happiness are usually the first ones to disappear when you actually need someone to show up. I laughed when Lauren told me this story. Laughed so hard I nearly dropped the taco I was eating for dinner in my sparsely furnished Austin apartment. Not because I wanted Tara to suffer or because I enjoyed her pain, but because there was something deeply satisfying about cosmic justice, about watching someone reap exactly what they'd sown, about seeing the universe deliver consequences with the precision of a logistics operation that I would have been proud to manage. She'd abandoned our marriage emotionally, and now she was dealing with actual abandonment. She'd prioritized digital relationships over real ones, and now her digital friends had vanished while her real husband was building a new life 4 states away. The woman who'd laughed harder at her phone than at me was now sitting alone, probably still on her phone, realizing that screens don't keep you warm at night, and emojis don't pay the bills, and validation from strangers doesn't fill the void left by destroying your family. Work in Austin was everything I needed it to be, demanding enough to keep my mind occupied, complex enough to feel challenging, and successful enough to remind me that I was actually competent at something, which was a nice change from feeling like a complete failure at marriage. The new facility was massive, state-of-the-art equipment everywhere. And I was building systems from scratch, which meant I got to implement all the efficiency protocols I've been wanting to try for years but couldn't because the old facility was stuck in their ways. My team was great, respectful, actually listened when I talked instead of scrolling through their phones, and within a month I'd increased our processing speed by 15%, which earned me a congratulatory email from corporate that I printed out and stuck on my fridge like a kindergartner showing off a gold star. The work filled my days, gave me purpose, reminded me that I was more than just the guy whose wife preferred texting strangers. But the real revelation, the thing that actually started healing the damage that Tara had inflicted, came from the peace. Just the simple, profound peace of coming home to an apartment where nobody was ignoring me, where I could eat dinner without competing with a phone for attention, where I could watch an entire movie without someone giggling at their screen and making me feel like background noise. I'd forgotten what it felt like to not be constantly anxious about whether my presence was bothering someone, to not have to strategically time conversations for moments when my wife might actually listen, to not feel like I was auditioning for relevance in my own life. The silence in my apartment wasn't lonely. It was restorative, like finally being able to breathe after holding your breath underwater for too long. Then I met Grace at a company networking event, one of those mandatory social things where you're supposed to mingle and make connections, but mostly just stand around eating mediocre appetizers and making small talk about weather and sports. She was a marketing consultant working with one of our vendor partners, sharp and funny in a way that felt effortless rather than performative. And when we started talking about the logistics of our recent campaign launch, I realized halfway through the conversation that she hadn't checked her phone once. Not once. We talked for 20 minutes about supply chain optimization and target demographics, and her phone stayed in her purse like it was a normal object rather than a vital organ that required constant monitoring. When I suggested grabbing dinner to continue the conversation, and yes, part of me was terrified that I was reading signals wrong and would look like an idiot, but mostly I just wanted to keep talking to someone who actually seemed interested in what I was saying. She agreed immediately, and we ended up at this Thai place downtown that had the best pad see ew I'd ever tasted, though that might have been influenced by the fact that I was eating it across from someone who left her phone in her purse for the entire 3-hour dinner. 3 hours. We talked for 3 hours without a single interruption, without her eyes glazing over and drifting toward a screen, without her laughing at something I couldn't see or typing responses to people more important than me. Real laughter filled the spaces between our words. Not the performance laugh Tara used for her phone friends, but genuine amusement at each other's stories and observations. Months passed in Austin, and somewhere between establishing efficient distribution protocols and actually remembering what it felt like to be treated like a human being worthy of attention, I stopped checking my phone obsessively for messages from Tara that never came anymore. The divorce papers had been filed, served, and were working their way through the legal system with all the speed and efficiency of a sloth on sedatives. But that was fine because I wasn't in a hurry. I was already living my new life, and the paperwork was just a formality at this point. Grace and I had settled into something that felt healthy and normal, which was revolutionary after years of feeling like I was in a relationship with someone who'd rather be anywhere else. We'd grab dinner after work and go hiking on weekends, have actual conversations where both people participated equally, and I'd find myself genuinely laughing at things that were happening in real life rather than watching someone else laugh at their screen. Then Lauren called again, and I knew from her tone that this was going to be good. "Guess who tried to use your Netflix login?" she asked, barely containing her amusement. I was at my apartment, cooking dinner for Grace, who was coming over later, and I had to put down the knife I was using to chop vegetables because I didn't want to accidentally injure myself while hearing whatever ridiculous update was coming. "Don't tell me, Tara?" I said, though I already knew the answer because who else would it be? "Her card declined again," Lauren continued, practically cackling now. "Apparently, she's been trying to use various accounts and services that were tied to your payment information, and they're all getting rejected one by one. The Netflix thing is just the latest casualty. She called Mom asking if you'd given her your new credit card information for household expenses, which is hilarious because you don't share a household anymore and haven't for months." I pictured Tara sitting on our old couch, her couch now, I guess, trying to watch some show that Lucas or Trent had probably recommended back when they were still pretending to be her friends, only to be confronted with a payment error message that reminded her that the life she'd taken for granted was funded by someone she'd treated like furniture. The streaming services, the spa memberships, the various subscriptions to things she'd never actually asked for, but had simply appeared because I'd been quietly managing our life while she'd been managing her group chats. All of it was disappearing piece by piece as automatic renewals failed and payment methods got rejected. It was like watching someone's lifestyle get repossessed in slow motion, each declined transaction. Another reminder that actions have consequences and marriages don't maintain themselves through neglect and phone addiction. "She's really struggling," Lauren added, though her tone suggested she wasn't particularly sympathetic to Tara's struggle. "The trio is completely gone. Lucas is engaged, and apparently his fiancée isn't thrilled about him maintaining friendships with women he used to text constantly. Trent's living his Seattle life and has basically ghosted everyone from his old life. And Eli's moved on to victim number whatever with his dead cat routine. Tara's friend group has evaporated, and she's starting to realize that all those deep connections she had were basically just people using her for emotional labor while giving nothing real back. Her support system turned out to be a house of cards, and now she's sitting alone, wondering how she ended up here. I should have felt vindicated, triumphant even, but mostly I just felt tired and grateful, tired of carrying the anger about something that was already over, and grateful that I'd had the courage to leave before the situation completely destroyed whatever was left of my self-worth. Tara had traded our marriage for emojis and validation from strangers, and she'd gotten exactly what that transaction was worth. Nothing permanent, nothing real, nothing that lasted beyond the moment when she stopped being entertaining or useful to the people who'd never actually cared about her in the first place. She'd been so busy looking at her screen, so consumed with the curated version of connection that social media and group chats provided, that she'd completely missed the real relationship that was dying right in front of her. And now she was dealing with the aftermath of choosing convenience over commitment, digital affirmation over actual intimacy. Maya started visiting me in Austin every other weekend, and those visits became the highlight of my existence in a way that made me realize how much I'd been missing while living in survival mode back home. We'd cook together. She was getting pretty good at making pancakes, though She had a tendency to flip them too early and create abstract art on the griddle, and we'd hike the trails around the city and we'd laugh, really laugh. The kind of genuine joy that doesn't require a screen or an audience or anyone's approval. She'd tell me about school and her friends and the things she was learning, and I'd actually listen instead of being half present, while worrying about whether my wife was going to acknowledge my existence that evening. One Saturday afternoon, after we'd spent the morning at a science museum looking at exhibits about space exploration and dinosaurs, Maya asked me the question I'd been dreading and preparing for in equal measure. "Daddy, do you still love Mommy?" she asked, her voice small and serious in the way kids sound when they're trying to understand adult problems that shouldn't be their burden to carry. We were sitting on my apartment balcony, drinking lemonade and watching the sunset paint the Austin sky in shades of orange and pink that looked fake but were somehow real. I thought about lying, about giving her some sanitized version that would protect Tara's image and maybe make this easier on everyone. But I'd promised myself I wouldn't lie to my daughter about important things, so I told her the truth in the gentlest way I could manage. "I love the version of her that existed before her phone became her best friend," I said, watching Maya's face carefully to gauge whether this was too much information or just enough. She nodded slowly when processing this with the wisdom of someone far beyond her 7 years, someone who'd watched her mother choose a screen over her family enough times to understand what I was saying without needing it spelled out. "She's sad now," Maya said. "She cries sometimes." I felt a twinge of something, not quite guilt, but maybe recognition that even though I'd done what I needed to do for my own survival, it had still caused pain. Even if that pain was the natural consequence of Tara's choices rather than my cruelty. "I'm sorry she's sad," I said honestly, because I was sorry that anyone was hurting, even if I wasn't sorry for leaving. But sometimes people make choices that hurt the people who love them. And when those people finally leave, the person who made those choices gets sad. That doesn't mean the leaving was wrong, it just means there are consequences. Maya seemed satisfied with this explanation, or at least as satisfied as a 7-year-old could be with the complicated reality of adult relationships falling apart. And we sat there in comfortable silence, watching the sun disappear below the horizon. The best revenge, I'd come to realize, wasn't blocking Tara or refusing to speak to her or trying to make her life difficult. It was simply living free, laughing louder, and never again waiting for someone to look up from their phone and remember I existed. I'd built a new life in Austin where I was valued at work, where I had a relationship with someone who understood that presence mattered, where my daughter could visit and see what healthy interaction looked like, and where I went to bed each night without the anxiety of wondering if I'd been replaced by a notification sound. Sometimes the universe teaches lessons in Wi-Fi disconnection, and the people who learn those lessons too late end up sitting alone with a frozen Netflix account, finally looking up from their screens to discover that everyone else has already left the room.